Morning, everyone. As most of you, or many of you, or some of you might know, we'll be going through Acts and a chapter a week. And this morning we'll come to Acts and chapter 8. You'll find Acts chapter 8 nestling between Acts chapter 7 and Acts chapter 9. If you look for it, that's usually where it is. And in Acts chapter 7, you find that in Acts chapter 7 we have the first martyr. Stephen was martyred. Josh looked at that last week. And in Acts chapter 9 we find Saul's conversion. But in Acts chapter 8 we find a little bit more about the character of Saul before he became a Christian. And it starts by telling us that Saul, in Acts chapter 7, we're introduced to Saul, and we find that when they stoned Stephen, they laid their clothes at the feet of one Saul of Tarsus, a young man called Saul. In Acts chapter 8, we find that it says at the beginning that Saul was giving approval to the stoning of Stephen. And that word, when you sort of look at the commentaries, the word approval, it isn't really strong enough. It says that he actually gave hearty approval. He was hearty in his approval of the martyrdom of Stephen. Now, there's a difference between just tacit approval and hearty approval, isn't there? You know, if I said to you this morning, hip hip, you will go, yeah. And if I said, give it a little bit more, you know, if we say, you know, on the 19th of March, it's Dave Richardson's birthday, and we're going to say, hip hip, we'll go, hooray! Sorry, Dave. Now, let's just a little bit, you know, hearty. Do you know what hearty means? Right, let's try again. Hip hip. Hooray! You feel sometimes it's going to be a really hard day, don't you? But Saul was hearty in his approval of the martyrdom of Stephen. He was behind it all the way. And not only does it say that he was hearty in his approval, but if we read a little bit further on, it says he actually ravaged the church. He went into the church and he ravaged the church. I don't know what that picture you get in your mind. But when I think of something being ravaged, being a farmer, I tend to think of sheep, and I tend to think of dogs ravaging a flock. I don't know if you've ever seen a flock being ravaged, but the dogs will come down and they'll grab a sheep and they'll rip it to pieces. And then they'll chase after another one and another one. And the sheep just don't know where to go. Some will just sort of lie down. Some will just be scattered into the bushes. They'll dive into a river. They're just frightened to death. And that's the idea that you have here in Acts chapter 8. That the church was ravaged. And he says that he went into houses, house after house. He took men and women. He had no compulsion and no compassion. He was after the church. And we read that on that day, a great persecution arose within the church. A great persecution arose. You see, up until that time, if you read through the early part of Acts, the church had grown. On the day of Pentecost, we read that there were 3,000 came to faith. In Acts chapter 4, we read that the number of disciples came to 5,000. In Acts chapter 5, we find that the number was multiplied. Starting from a small number of disciples, the church grew and grew and grew. And then suddenly, there was this persecution. There'd been an element of that. You know, Peter and John had been arrested. But because of the the popularity of the Christian church, nothing was done. Yes, they've been beaten, but there was very little persecution, minimal persecution. The church had grown, and at this point, the church was probably, well, Christian historians tell us that there was probably about 10,000 Christians worshipping in Jerusalem. But suddenly, there was persecution, and the church was scattered. It was scattered abroad. And they must have actually wondered what hit them. Have you ever thought what it'd be like, from being a popular meeting together, suddenly there was persecution. They were being hauled off, murdered, put into prison. And they must have felt that all hell had broken loose against them. That's what they must have felt, wasn't it? The whole hell had broken loose. And in actual fact, all hell had broken loose against them. That's the fact of the matter. Because Satan, there's two forces at work in the world today. The force of good and the forces of evil. And I know that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and spiritual rulers in high places. But God and the devil uses people. That's the fact, isn't it? He uses people. And he was using this man, Saul of Tarsus, to destroy the church. He was coming against the church. This is the picture that we have at the beginning of Acts in chapter 8. He was destroying the church, and the church was scattered. Stephen was the first martyr. That's what we have in history, that Stephen was the first martyr. Since that day, historians tell us that there have been 75 million martyrs in the Christian faith. 75 million that have lost their lives because they belong to Christ. Since 1900, in the last 125 years, there have been 45 million martyrs. There have been more in the last 125 years than in the preceding 1800 years combined. That is the state. It affects us today. Satan is still trying to destroy the church, and is trying to destroy your life in Christ. There's an enemy that is on the attack. And that's been going down throughout the years. About 1820 or thereabouts, the Protestant church entered China. And when they entered China, they've been working in China for years and years and years. In about I'm not dead sure on the dates of this, but about 1908 or 9, I think, in that region, a bloke, a man called Robert Hutchinson, went as a missionary to China. I know that. I don't know actually when the day he went, but that was my granddad. He went as a missionary to China. And when my parents had their children, they named the first one Robert Edward. That's my big brother. He was named after my two grandfathers, Robert and Edward. They then had a second son, and they called him William Henry. And he was named after their two brothers that they like. Their mum had a brother and my dad had a brother, both called William. And my great-grandfather was called Henry, so they called him William Henry. They then had a daughter, which they called Lucy Elizabeth, again after their two mothers. Dad's mum was Elizabeth and mum's mum was Lucy. When they got to me, they were kind of stumped. They didn't really know what to call me. They had a name for a girl, but they didn't really know what to call a boy. And so they called me James Mountford. Now, can you think what it's like growing up at a school with a name like Mountford? You know, it's... Well, you just don't talk about it, do you? You know? If anybody said, what's the M stand for, you let them guess. And they go through all the names, and they go through Mark and Matthew and Michael, and eventually they came to Marmaduke, and it still wasn't right. And I couldn't even spell it till I was 15. But my grandmother, she, as a young lady, went out as a missionary nurse to China. And that's where my grandparents met, in China. And they married. And she was called Mountford. And so, you know, as I've grown older, I have a higher regard for my middle name. And now if anybody asks, I go, actually, I'm James Mountford Hutchinson. There's a certain ring to it, isn't there, don't you think? But I have this sort of feeling about it. But also I have a feeling for, in a way, for China. Because during the time that they were there was a rebellion when the emperor was dethroned and it became a republic. China became a republic. And just to give you a sense of what it was like in those days, I've got a postcard that was written from China by one of my granddad's contemporaries, because granddad and grandma, they actually left China in about 1912 or 13. But they got an update. And this is an update from China. And it's from GL. That's all he put, GL. And this is to the Reverend R. Hutchinson and Mrs. Hutchinson via Siberia, because the letters went via the Trans-Siberian Railway in those days. And this was written from Hankow on September the 7th in about 1915 or 16, I think. And it's the annual greetings. How are you all? Wishing you were here in China during these stormy times, ? Because the times at that time were, we are stuck up here, out of the way. We ought to be back at work, of course, but can't get on account of the fighting. The Reds have made rapid progress. If their success continues, all sorts of things may happen in Canton. We're okay. We have no warm clothes, that's all. But again, we may get down before long, because they were up in the hills outside of Canton. They're very, very British, though. We've had lovely weather and quite a good time. The schools, and I fear our houses, are occupied by soldiers. It's some muddle to go back to. All the best. That's what it was like as a missionary in China at that time. And that happened until 1949. In 1949, there was the communist revolution in China. And all missionaries were expelled from China. All the pastors were put in prison. Bibles were confiscated. The church went underground. During the time from 1820-ish up to 1949, they estimated that there were just less than about 800,000 Christians in China. The church wondered how it would fare. The West looked on. We sent Bibles, they smuggled Bibles in, but there was no real knowledge of how the church was doing. In 1979, things opened a bit so they could see what was going on in China. They found that the church had been maintained mostly by the women, and the church had grown phenomenally in those 30 years. They estimated there was something like 10 million Christians in China in those 30 years. Phenomenal growth. It says that the church was scattered in Acts and chapter 8. The church was scattered. The word scattered, there are two words that are interpreted scattered in the Greek. The first is like you would scatter ashes. You know, I don't know if you've ever scattered anybody's ashes. We did that a few years ago. We scattered my sister's ashes. And she wanted to be scattered on the top of Littledale. And we went and we scattered Lucy's ashes. And it was just a little breeze, and the ashes just were scattered. They went. They disappeared. You go there now and there's no trace of where we scattered her ashes. The other word for scattered is how you scatter seed. Strangely, the word that is used, or not strangely really, in Acts chapter 8 is that the church was scattered like seed. It was scattered like seed. The church grew. The church exploded because of the persecution, or in spite of the persecution. I have a friend that I know, and he was telling me that when his two daughters became old enough to drive, they'd worked a little bit and they'd saved up enough money. And so rather than him buying them a car apiece, he thought it would be best if they bought their own car, and he would just insure them. Poor choice, because it cost him a fortune to insure the cars. But he thought if they bought their own car, they would look after it better. It would mean more to them. We sometimes look, don't we, at the church in the West, and we wonder if we hold it so loosely because it hasn't cost us a great deal, our faith. The church that is persecuted is the church that grows. There have been many persecutions over the years, but it was Tertullian who said in the 2nd century that it's the blood of the martyrs that is the seed of the church. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. We hold it so loosely, don't we, within the West, and yet where the church, where it is costly, the church grows. We've all been aware over this last 24, 48 hours of what's going on in Iran. In Iran, there are about 1.2 million Christians who face persecution every day of their lives because of what they believe. But it costs them something, so they believe something. They hold it dearly. The church was scattered. Now, we are together today. We're all together. But this week, we will be scattered. You know, we'll be scattered around this area. Oh, we won't be scattered because of persecution, but we will be scattered. It says in Acts chapter 8 that as they were scattered, they preached Jesus as they went. They preached Jesus as they went. And then Philip came down to Samaria, and he proclaimed Jesus. Most people preached, he proclaimed. You see, as you go, you will be preaching Jesus. Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians, he says, you are a letter read of all people. You are a letter read of all men, written by the Spirit on your hearts. You're read by everyone. But the issue is, isn't it, sometimes that we are scattered, but as we are scattered, are we like ashes that make no difference? Or are we like seed? It says in Proverbs, a lovely little verse in Proverbs, there is one that scattereth, yet increaseth. There is one that scattereth, that yet increases. Are we ones that scatter, that increase, or are we those that are just are like the wind, that the wind blows fast away? The challenge, I believe, is that as we go from this place and we are scattered, some of you will be on the school run, some of you will be in community, some of you will be going to work every day this week. Some of you, if you're like our house group, will have hospital appointments and doctor's appointments. You'll be scattered. But what is it that you're scattering? The early church were scattered, but they increased. The challenge for us today, I believe, is whether, as we scattered from this place, our aim should be to preach Jesus. Oh, we might not proclaim him as Philip proclaimed him, but we will preach him by the way that we live our lives. But it's not just how we live our lives. The early church opened their mouths. They opened their mouths about their faith. They talked about Jesus. Pray God that as a church we begin to talk about our faith. On Tuesday evening, we were at the prayer meeting, and Dot just asked me what I was preaching about, and I gave her a vague reply. I'm usually vague. And on Thursday, I think it was Thursday, it might have been Wednesday, she sent me what she was thinking of using as the last song today. And the last song, we'll sing it in a bit, not for a bit. But she had no idea what I was talking about, but it just seemed to fit so beautifully with what I'm talking about, or what I'm trying to talk about. And it really quite surprised me how it fit with where we're at. And so I was coming down to the house group on Thursday night. Elaine was driving, and as we were driving down, I started humming the song, right, that Dot had said. And Elaine didn't just recognise the tune, and she braked sharply, and she said, "What's that noise? I think the wheel's falling off." It's dead true. But when we get there, when we sing that song, if it doesn't resonate, if the words don't resonate in our hearts with who we are as a church, with what we're about as a church, then I believe that the wheels are coming off the church. Yeah? The wheels are coming off if it doesn't resonate in our hearts when we get there. We're going to pray first. We're going to pray for because we're thinking about the persecuted church and persecution to a degree, I think we should pray for the persecuted church initially, and just particularly perhaps the Christians that are in this moment in Iran that are facing serious difficulties. Let's just pray.